That's the idea. So what's the historical context here? The traditional chord naming system is rooted in the major scale. Now, remember, the general idea is like before, Western music kind of took off, I think most people were actually using possibly five note scale degrees and maybe playing more in a Mixolydian mode than in the major and minor keys. But then the major and minor keys became popular. The 7 notes became something that was learned before the 12 notes. That's why the piano kind of looks at the natural 7 notes and then expands to the 12. And the major key was the thing that people liked to play at that time over anything else. So notice what happened then. They actually replaced the modes. The Greeks came up with 7 modes, right, which makes sense. But then we basically said, hey, we only like the one mode, which is the Ionian mode, and we're not even going to use the Greek name. We're just going to now call it a major scale. So the major scale, you can see that really, again, the naming convention makes us think and feel that major scale is the thing that basically everything else is built from. Now, from a conventional standpoint, you can build everything. That is going to be our Rosetta Stone to build everything out. But we don't want to visualize that is the only mode, because today people play in different modes. Minor mode for sure, minor scale, but also the Dorian and the Mixolydian are quite common, and we'd like to mix in the other ones as well, particularly from chord creation. So all chords are compared against the Ionian or major scale as a reference point. So again, the Ionian mode was renamed kind of to the major scale because that's the thing, that was the scale, right? It's like the king of scales, right? In that time frame. And then we basically measured all other modes to it. Now, when you build chords, there's a couple ways you can do it. One, you can visualize the chord on the fretboard or on your instrument. 2, you can build it by formula. And 3, you can build it by scale degrees or distances from the root. So when we look at the distances from the root, we often compare it to the major key. We say, here's the distances for the major, and then we compare all other chords or scale degrees to that. So, but again, that's artificial because all the modes are actually put together kind of like a fractal picture. So to say that the major scale is somehow separate or the thing that creates all other scales is kind of like from a physics standpoint saying that the world is like in a special location when you're trying to measure different things. It's all relative. It's just that we happen to be here. If you want to get the proper measurements, you got to think about the perspective. It's more like a fractal situation with the modes. They are all, combined together. You can derive any one of them from the other one. So although we want to use the major scale as our Rosetta Stone, you don't want to think of it as like it's different than all the other scales, like it's not intertwined. It's not completely entwined with all the other scales. So minor scales and other modes are treated as derivations, leading to a mismatch between theory and practical fretboard use. So the blues and jazz players inserted Mixolydian style 7 chords into the system by brute force, naming them as dominant 7s. So people weren't really playing the Mixolydian mode during the kind of classical time frame because they were mainly playing the major and then they kind of tacked on the minor. And again, you can just look at the names. The major makes you feel like that is the king of the king scale. It's not even a mode. It's been risen above modes. And then the minor is subordinate to the major, and everything else is basically kind of ignored. Now, again, that's probably not the way you want to see it these days because you'd like to be able to see that they're all intertwined oftentimes. So that also led to chord construction where they didn't really have proper chord names for things that were built off of different chords, like the Mixolydian, which is quite common for bluesy kind of stuff, has a really kind of jammy feel, maybe not as much for an opera where you're trying to tell a story with it, but when you're just trying to groove, obviously it works quite well. So the blues guys came in and said, hey, we need to force into the naming construction the 7 chords because the 7 in a Mixolydian has a minor 7. So we'll talk about the intervals later. There was no way to do that. So they forced a whole nother naming convention of the 7 chords. Why don't they just call it Mixolydian? That would have been the easy thing to do. That would be the logical thing to do. These are Mixolydian chords. But they don't want to do that because we have to keep with the same convention, the saying that the major's not really a mode and the minor's not really a mode. So the Mixolydian, we can't refer to the fact that the whole chord set is actually based on the Mixolydian mode. We have to call it something other than that. So they came up with 7 chords. So that's cool, all right? So this results in cluttered naming convention that lacks room for modal nuance. So we end up with a system that kind of covers all the bases. We can name all the different variations of the chords and possibly have a single name for each of them, which is kind of nice. But they don't give us any contextual understanding. They seem to be removed from where they're actually played within the song, and they don't give us any context of where they are on the fretboard, location-wise, or on any instrument. So let me just give you a quick idea of the buckets. We'll go into the normal naming convention later and try to get into the nuances of it. Right now, I just want to say a general idea of why there's a problem with it and why looking at it from a modal-based system is intuitive and an easier thing to do, and something that I would say is something you want to do as a precursor or at the same time that you're learning chords, because again, it'll help you break this false idea of the natural notes are the dominant notes and the Ionian is really the major scale and it's the king of scales, and then you have the subordinate minor, and then all the other modes are not even worth talking about, right? We need to break that mentality because it's probably not the way you want to think of things in a modern musical sense. So we have the major. So remember, we have the major and we build a triad when we build basically chords. So everything was based on the major. So you can build the chords 3 ways. You can think of it, visualize it on the fretboard. You can visualize the shape, or you can visualize, you can use the formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or you can build it by intervals, meaning you look at the root, whatever the root is, and you look at the distances from the root. We'll talk more about intervals later. And then they added the minor. So now the minor is something that became fairly popular. So now we're going to say the minor chords are going to be the ones that have a minor third related to them. Now, why are these 2 naming conventions not optimal? Notice that if you say something is the major and you're playing something in the key of C, there's going to be 3 different major chords you can build off of, which is going to be the Ionian, the 1, 4, 5, the Ionian, the Mixolydian, and the Lydian. But if I call them all major triads, it leads me to believe that I'm actually shifting the entire shape up, which isn't exactly correct. So it kind of leads to a mismatch of where it lines up on the fretboard, and it doesn't allow you to expand to things like adding the 6, the 7, the 9, and the 11 to them. Similarly, the minor bucket, if there's going to be 3 different minor chords in a normal scale. So if I'm in the key of C major or A minor, then you've got the Aeolian chord, you've got the Dorian, and you've got the Phrygian. But you're going to name the triads all minor triads. That doesn't give you any visualization of where it's actually located on the fretboard, right? And so that it's not and plus, again, if you add the 7, 9, 11, and 13, it won't be the same. And so again, you can't really tell by the normal naming construction whether the chord fits diatonically. It has the same 7 notes, or if it's outside the key somehow. I'd like a chord system that tells me if it's diatonically in the key or not. And you can easily do that by just recognizing that modes exist. Then you've got the dominant. These are basically the 7 chords, the bluesy chords, where they kind of said, hey, look, the Mixolydian mode doesn't fit into the major and minor system at all. So why didn't they just call it a Mixolydian mode? Well, they couldn't call it a Mixolydian mode because, again, they're trying to pretend modes don't exist. People are scared of modes. I think this is a conspiracy. The modes are actually easier, not more difficult. It would be easier to learn the modes, okay? And so they made it a 7 chord, and that's going to be the entire bucket for basically the blues chords based off the Mixolydian. And then you've got the diminished. So the diminished, again, the Locrian mode doesn't fit in any of them. Now, again, people don't play in Locrian, but you do build chords off the Locrian, so you need to be able to name the chords. So they made another bucket called diminished, which again isn't exactly based on the major scale, which is normally what it is, but they kind of based it off the minor, but then it still didn't work for the Locrian, so they created a half diminished, which like with the dominants, like with the 7 chords, they might as well have called the half diminished chords the Locrian intervals. They basically had to just make up another thing and say this is they could have just called it these are the Locrian intervals, right? But they didn't, but we want to pretend like modes don't exist, so they called them half diminished. Okay, so it doesn't really give us any context, and it's kind of an intimidating term. Half diminished is kind of intimidating. So, and then you also have augmented and suspended, which could help us to make more complex chords that are outside the diatonic key. So again, we'll get into these chord constructions later, but I just want to just kind of note the arbitrariness here, right? We started with the major, and then we tacked on the minor, and then they kind of made a whole nother bucket for the Mixolydian mode and called it the dominant or 7 chord. And then we had to make these 2 other buckets to basically encapsulate the Locrian mode. And then we have the augmented, which could help us to pick up anything that doesn't fit in the key. So it would be a lot easier if we just recognized the modes, and it would give us more modal context. All right, so let me get an idea of this. If we're in the key of C, notice that the Nashville number system would basically say, look, we're going to be playing the 1, 4, 5. The 1, 4, 5. Now, most people would say those are 3 major chords. The 1, 4, 5 in the key of C. And that's true. It's going to have a triad. It's going to have basically the same shape. But you can see the shape around the chord is not the same. If I look at this shape around it, here versus around here, for example, it's not the same shape. They're in different locations on the fretboard. And also, we're playing off of different notes. So again, most people would say that's a C major, and then you go into an F major, and then a G major. But that's not as useful, because then if I was playing in C sharp, in the key of C sharp, then I would have all different notes. I would have 3 different majors based on the note name. I'd rather name them by continent, the equivalent of continents here, and which could be the Nashville number system, or you use the modes, and that tells me where the location is within the larger shape. So if you don't do that, what's going to happen, you're going to get confused and say, look, that when I go from this major chord to this major chord, I shifted the whole shape back over here. But that's not normally what happens, because you're playing something that's in the same diatonic key. So what you want to envision when someone says we're playing the 1, 4, 5 is that all the 1, 4, 5 are in the same key, and you're going to 3 different triads which build a major triad, meaning they have a major third from the root, but they're actually going from the 1, which is the Ionian, the 4, which is the Lydian, and the 5, which is the Mixolydian. That helps you to visualize the actual shape on the guitar. And so you might say, well, then I have to learn 3 things instead of just 1 thing. Not really, because you know that the triad shape is the same. If you're playing the guitar, the triad shape for the 1, 4, 5 is the same. Just remember that the 4 and the 5 are not the same location, right? The 4 and the 5 have a different overarching shape. They're in a different spot on the fretboard. So I don't even really think it takes any more memorization, and it's going to really open up the fretboard, as they say, because you'll be able to expand and be able to realize that this is a different shape that you're building off of. You're not moving the whole shape over here. You're building you're building within the same overarching shape. So that's going to be, the general idea. So that means that when we build the chords, it would be easier to basically name them by the Nashville number system or the absolute modes rather than the note names. Now, the other problem is that what if I was playing in the key of A minor? So it has all the same notes, but now it's in the key of A minor. From a scale degree system, what would happen? They would name this not the 6 anymore, but the 1. The Nashville number system is is marketed kind of like a shortcut to say, look, we're not going to do that. We're going to play as though we're in the key of C, the related major, and keep that as the 6, which sounds like a shortcut, but it's not actually a shortcut. That's the logical thing to do. It would be easier to do that because, look, I want to keep that as the 6, And I want to recognize that if I play all of the minors, which is going to be the Aeolian, the Dorian, and the Phrygian, I don't want to rename it to the 1-4-5 in the key of A minor. I want to recognize that I'm in the key of A minor, but keep the numbers as it's note number 6. It's the location number 6, 2, and 4, or 6, 2, and 3. Why? Because that's the same numbering system. I already know the numbers because I know that those are going to be the minor chords. Because if you memorize the chord constructions based on the major key, the 1-4-5 are major, and the 2-3 and 6 are minor. So why would I then go to the minor key and have to memorize that now the 1-4-5 in the minor key is now the minors, when I could just keep the numbers the same and say I'm playing around the 6. So I want to play the 6-2-3. If I want to play all the minors, I'm going to play the 6-2-3. And the tonic will be the A as the tonic. You see, that's way more intuitive. You're gonna open up and visualize the fretboard a lot faster using that logic than you would changing the number system all the time. All right.